You have long made the argument that Russia has been at war with the West in every sort of front except for the military program. Can you explain where you're coming from in that argument and why you think so?
Well, certainly the easiest way to look at that, of course, is it's not just me that has been arguing that. It's also Russia that has been telling itself and its people for more than a decade that they are in a state of conflict with the West, that they are, in fact, in this clash of different worldviews, and that the only thing missing from that was the open military conflict, which now we're seeing in Ukraine. Of course, that has a really unfortunate consequence, which is these young soldiers fighting in Ukraine, that's all that they have ever known. They've only ever been told by state propaganda that the war is already on.
So why is Russia doing this, and what is Russia's endgame?
Well, one of the great advantages now that we have to this honesty and clarity from Russia about what it actually wants is that they've stated very clearly what the end game is. President Putin has said he wants to restore the Russian Empire. He wants to reverse what he says are the historical mistakes of 100 years ago, when these new countries that we think of as being sovereign, independent nations were set up within the confines of the old Russian Empire. He wants to correct that. And the first step in that process is to eliminate Ukraine as a nation and Ukrainians as a people.
And so does it stop there?
Absolutely not. No, he said very clearly that this is not the end of the process. In fact, the Russian Empire, and this is one of the key problems, included countries that are now full-fledged members of NATO, of the EU, of the Western community of nations. And that's why this incompatibility of these two worldviews, Russia thinking it's entitled to empire, us thinking that no, these are sovereign independent states that have a right to determine their own futures, is not going to be resolvable because there's just no common ground between them.
How would you describe or assess the way that Western allies and NATO and the West has responded in defense of Ukraine?
It's been generally too little just in time. And one of the reasons for that, unfortunately, is that in all of the years preceding this open conflict, Russia mounted an extremely successful information and influence campaign to persuade decision makers across the West that you can't offend or impede Russia, because if you do, there is going to be an all-out conflict with exchange of nuclear weapons. That campaign has been so successful that that assumption forms the basis for so many decisions that Western decision makers are taking about how to support Ukraine. That's been the key break on providing Ukraine with the things that it needs to bring this war to a speedy solution. And of course, it protracts the war. It gives Russia freedom of movement, a permissive environment. It allows Russia to pretend to itself that it's not actually suffering the consequences of the war. This is a special military operation, as they put it, that is outside Russia's borders. So we're playing into that fiction by not supporting Ukraine as much and as fast as possible in order to bring this war to an end.
I'm particularly fascinated by your too little just-in-time analysis here. Do you think that allies, NATO partners, and Western countries that are providing the support when it comes to the military aid, do you think that they share that assessment and perhaps will start to act faster and start taking bigger, bolder steps? Ukraine's asking for fighter jets. Do you think that there might be a shift in how quickly or how forcefully allies respond to those requests?
Well, first, it's tricky to talk about a shared assessment because there are very different views between the different Western allies. And some of the smallest allies have been the most eager to step up and provide, in some cases, entire sectors of military capability, stripping out their own arsenals to provide it to Ukraine, because they are in no doubt that Ukraine is just the front line of a much bigger war. And the sooner they defeat Russia, the better for themselves, better to defeat them in Ukraine than when Russia comes to them. And then, of course, you have the much larger allies, which are far more reticent, which have been feeling their way steadily forward, incrementally, feeling for these Russian red lines that they are convinced exist because Russia tells them so, and only discovering when they get there that those red lines evaporate and that the nuclear threats are based on nothing. But the question, will that process now accelerate? Unfortunately, I don't see any signs of it doing so because we have been through this repetitive process so many times. The most recent conversations about supplying main battle tanks to Ukraine is just the latest iteration of exactly the same process.
The red lines that you say when the Western countries get to that sort of mark and then it evaporates. The threat of nuclear war is something, though, do you not think that Western allies need to take that seriously because the world is dealing with Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Putin is unpredictable?
Of course it needs to be taken seriously. That's why we say there is a non-zero chance of Putin loosing a nuclear weapon. But the problem we have is that everybody's been focused on Russia's information operations using nuclear weapons. All of the propaganda, all of the rhetoric, all of the threats, that's what Russia keeps on using because it gets the same excited, gratifying reaction from Western politicians. So everybody's focused on that. instead of looking at Russia's actual nuclear doctrine, instead of what the people who own the nuclear weapons, the armed forces, and the people who would need to make the use case for them for how they could be used making things better, not worse for Russia, what they say about use of nuclear weapons, and that is a very, very different thing. Now, it's clear that using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine or elsewhere would be absolutely catastrophic for Russia, not because of Western retaliation, because it may not be that retaliation comes in a form that is devastating for Russia, but because of all of the other processes worldwide that would unleash, things that Russia does not want to see happen. Nuclear proliferation elsewhere, because it makes sense if Russia has unlocked this nuclear taboo for everywhere that feels themselves under threat by a bigger neighbor, to push forward their own nuclear program as rapidly as possible, because that's the form of defense that is left. Russia does not want that to happen and has worked extremely hard over decades to prevent that from happening.
Is there anything that stops Vladimir Putin?
Absolutely not. The only way in which Vladimir Putin can be stopped is severe and catastrophic defeat of his armed forces, because the worldview that drives this campaign against Ukraine is one from a previous century. It is atavistic. It does not count losses or defeats in the way that Western liberal democracies would. The only way, unfortunately, to put up a stop sign for Russian behavior is to confront it directly.
And do you think that is something that is realistic?
It's happening in Ukraine. This is exactly what Ukraine is doing for the rest of the world at the moment, setting the limits of Russian power and demonstrating to Russia that their worldview, that imperial view that they are entitled to govern these other countries and these other countries have no right to exist, doesn't have a place in the 21st century. So depending on what kind of world we want going into the next decade, it's that determines how much we should support Ukraine. If we do not want Russia's ideas of how it should behave in the world to prevail, then we need Ukraine to win.